Lord Richard Dannatt is a retired British Army general and former head of the British Army. Welcome to our program, Lord Dannatt.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and a privilege to join you again.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has declared 3-day ceasefire from May 8th to May 11th. What is Vladimir Putin trying to achieve by declaring these several days so-called ceasefires in Ukraine?
Well, he knows that President Zelensky and Ukraine have been willing for some time to have a 30-day ceasefire, or indeed asking for a permanent ceasefire, which he has not wished to agree to. But he decided for his own reasons to offer that ceasefire from the 8th to the 11th of May. Obviously, that's covering the period of his victory parade yesterday in Moscow and other European countries commemorating the end of the Second World War. So he obviously sees it to his advantage to offer that very short ceasefire. But of course, as has been reported widely over the last few days, it has not been much of a ceasefire, and there have been a tremendous number of violations of that ceasefire. So I think, like everything else that Vladimir Putin said, you cannot trust him, and he doesn't speak the truth.
Also, it is interesting that in our previous conversations, you said that Russian generals could pose threat to Putin. They even can topple Vladimir Putin's regime. Is this still possible? And would they like to support ceasefire in Ukraine? What is your take on that?
Well, it's a good question, and you're right to take me back to comments I was making 2 or 3 years ago. At the start of the war, when it seemed that the decision to attack Ukraine had been entirely Vladimir Putin's, and it was clearly a bad decision because it produced the failure by the Russian forces to capture Kyiv and to destroy the Zelensky regime, and was causing great damage to the Russian military. I thought it was possible that senior generals might decide that this is so awful for Russia as a country that they might decide to mount some kind of coup. Now, 3 years on, more than 3 years on, the Russian military seemed prepared to accept the million-plus casualties that they've already suffered as a result of their illegal and outrageous attack into Ukraine. And I no longer take the view that senior generals might be the ones to rise up against Putin. That said, he has such a control over the state, he has such a control over state media, that maybe he has managed to snuff out any form of opposition against him. And it would seem that Putin is Russia, Russia is Putin, that's what his thinking is, and that nobody appears prepared to challenge him, which is why this terrible war is dragging on, with the huge loss of life in Ukraine, the huge damage to infrastructure in Ukraine, not to mention that in Russia as well.
And what is your take of these generals? What do they think about the ceasefire offer from the United States? What is your opinion on that? Do you feel that Russia's high command does support this offer from the United States to have a ceasefire, or they just want to go on to continue their war because they have some successes on the ground?
Well, the whole question of a ceasefire is very complicated. I think we have to look at it first from Donald Trump's point of view. We know that during the presidential election campaign, he talked very loudly about he could end the war with a telephone call, he could end the war in 24 hours. Well, this has absolutely proved not to be the case. And I think most of us have said all the way along that a ceasefire and an end to the war can only come if Ukraine and President Zelensky agrees to that. We can't have a repeat of the 1930s when Czechoslovakia was sacrificed over the heads of its leadership and people for the convenience of Britain and France and to the benefit of Adolf Hitler. So it's really important that any discussion, any moves towards a ceasefire is as President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government want. Now, Vladimir Putin believes that he is still winning this war. So from his point of view, he would like to continue. And I think the likelihood of him accepting a ceasefire on anything other than terms that are damaging to Ukraine, I think is very unlikely. So I think the whole notion of ceasefire, while of course people want to see the end of killing and the end of destruction of the land of Ukraine, but it has to be fair and it has to be an agreement that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government are comfortable with and agree to, albeit under some pressure.
And don't you think that Putin is also afraid of accepting the ceasefire offer because Russian hardliners can put more pressure on Kremlin, on his regime in such case?
Well, I think that is a very good point, because the longer this war goes on, the more it is costing the Russian economy, the more Russian citizens are being killed. And of course, if he was to stop the war prematurely, people would then say, well, that was a waste. What was all that about? That was a very bad decision. So that's when hardliners might find the courage to try and topple him. But of course, in those circumstances, one has to ask, is the situation then going to be worse than the situation now? I mean, I think we have to come right back to where we ought to be, to say, despite the propaganda that's coming out of the Kremlin and the modest advances that Russian forces have made in the east of Ukraine, actually Russia is suffering considerably in this war. The West needs to place stronger economic sanctions on Russia, and the whole of the Russian economy and Russian people have got to feel the pain. And I think this then puts Ukraine in a much stronger position. So the West needs to stand together. It needs to stand united. It needs to remain supporting Ukraine with military equipment and on the battlefield, but also put stronger economic sanctions on Russia to try and bring the Russian people to their senses.
Also, there are lots of turning points in this war. Also, this Prigozhin march to Moscow. Do you feel that if the war goes on, there would be even more the serious threats to Putin's regime from hardliners, from mercenaries, even from Russian, for example, from Russian veterans coming home after participating in this war?
Well, I think the Prigozhin situation was unusual and possibly unique insofar as Prigozhin was heading the Wagner mercenary group, which was a large and powerful group, and therefore he knew that those men would follow him. Now, I think it's a very different situation to say whether a Russian general or another Russian mercenary company would have the power and the support to mount the kind of threat which Prigozhin did to the Kremlin. And of course, we know what eventually happened to Prigozhin. He was killed, and his rebellion melted away, and that threat has ended. So it's a complicated set of circumstances. I think I come back to what I said before. Putin does fear the hardliners. If he stops the war prematurely, he will come under pressure from them. I think it's much better, as I said a moment or two ago, for the West to stand absolutely united with Ukraine, to go on supporting you on the battlefield, giving you the weapons and equipment and training that you need, and put stronger economic sanctions on the Russian economy, so that eventually the Russian people realize that their leadership has made a mistake and that the Russian population want to have a different kind of government, which is better for them, better for Ukraine, and better for relations with the West, and therefore the security of Europe.
Also, according to the Washington Post, there are two groups in Kremlin who have different view on how the war should go on. The first group is trying to convince Putin to end the war by accepting Trump's proposal on a ceasefire in Ukraine because they are concerned about the state of Russian economy. On the other hand, the second group is more pro-war. They are trying to convince Putin to instead continue the war against Ukraine. What kind of group has more chances to prevail? And don't you think that Putin is in a kind of hopeless situation where he doesn't have any much choices to make because of the inner pressure inside Kremlin from both groups?
Well, you could be right. I have no sympathy for Putin at all, and if he's under pressure from those two groups, then I'm afraid this is a problem entirely of his own making. Of those two options, I think we've discussed already in this conversation that he's unlikely to take the path of the hardliners. So it brings us back to any peace offer that President Trump might make. Now, as I said before, I hope that any peace offer that Trump makes will be one that President Zelensky is content to agree with. But, you know, if there's a ceasefire for 30 days, or a ceasefire that might even become a longer ceasefire, that is just that. It's a ceasefire. It is not a formula for a peace agreement. It's not a formula for the ending of this conflict. And I think this is where one has to look elsewhere in history. One has to look elsewhere in the world. And I see parallels with the war in Korea that started in 1950. It ended with a ceasefire in 1953, but there has never been a peace plan. There's never been an agreement on how the Korean Peninsula should be run. And I fear that that might be what happens in Ukraine, that if the Trump ceasefire is accepted, it'll then be extended possibly. But a ceasefire is one thing, but it's not a formula for a lasting peace. And I worry considerably about that.
And also British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz are today in Kyiv meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. According to Reuters, they are finalizing this plan to set an ultimatum to Vladimir Putin to begin 30-day ceasefire. And there are discussions on whether this could be done only by Ukraine, giving chance to Russia to also agree with this proposal, or another option is just to give Russia little time to respond to this proposal, and if Russia declines this offer, they will impose sanctions on Russia. How can you assess this new plan from European allies and the United States, and do you feel that Russia will agree with this ultimatum?
Well, I think it's a good thing that the leaders of France, Germany and the United Kingdom, and I think Donald Tusk of Poland is joining them as well, that they are there to have talks with President Zelensky, because, as I've said before, what would be absolutely wrong is if other countries, not Ukraine, was to propose and agree a ceasefire with Russia over the heads of the Ukrainian government. So it's really important that those European leaders are sitting down, discussing with President Zelensky, so that whatever is suggested, possibly by Trump and with support of other European leaders, it is in line with something that President Zelensky is prepared to accept in the best interests of Ukraine. Now, whether this will mean, at least temporarily, the land that's been lost on the battlefield in the east of Ukraine remains occupied by Russian soldiers, or whether it means that Ukraine, at least for the time being, gives up its ambition to join NATO. I don't know what the terms of those discussions are going to be, but the encouraging thing from my point of view is that those European leaders are in Kyiv today. They're discussing it with your president, and that whatever is put on the table is something that the European countries can support, because it's something that President Zelensky is prepared to agree to. And if it needs Donald Trump then to be the one to negotiate with Vladimir Putin, well then so be it. But I fear it's only going to be a ceasefire, and it's not going to be the beginnings of a lasting peace settlement.
And also, do you expect this ceasefire to last more than 30 days? What could happen after this 30 days?
Well, you ask a very good question, and the answer is one doesn't know. I think what has been the history in the past, that a short ceasefire that's agreed then does become a longer ceasefire, because both sides can see the advantage of the end of killing, the end of the disruption of their infrastructure. So once you've got the beginnings of a ceasefire, and a 30-day ceasefire is a reasonable length of time, you can then start to build on that. But then, of course, it opens questions. How is that ceasefire going to be monitored? How is it going to be policed? And we come back to the question of whether Vladimir Putin would be prepared to accept other Western troops on the ground in Ukraine to play their part in reassuring the Ukrainian population or to monitoring the ceasefire, or whether the ceasefire can only be monitored by satellite surveillance and by aerial surveillance and by the use of reconnaissance drones. So the whole question, or the second question after agreeing a ceasefire, is how is it going to be monitored and how will violations of it be enforced or punished? So the questions are many and are only just discussing. And of course, the first question is, are there sufficient terms on the table to make a ceasefire acceptable to both Russia and Ukraine? And as I said many times in this conversation, it must be acceptable to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government.
Also, US Vice President J.D. Vance says that Russia is asking too much in negotiations over the war in Ukraine on ceasefire. Do you believe that Trump's team is finally getting this understanding, finally begins to understand that Russia is not really interested in a fair deal?
I think that's right. I mean, I'm afraid we cannot trust Putin. I don't think a fair deal is going to be on the table, because even if President Zelensky was to agree that temporarily the eastern part of Ukraine that's currently occupied by Russian soldiers, that should be a new, at least temporary status quo, that is in Putin's advantage and it's not in Ukraine's advantage. But you have to come back to the disappointing realization that the Russians, having occupied that part of 20% of Ukraine territory in the east, they're not going to withdraw voluntarily. And we've already seen over the last 3 years of fighting that despite the help from the West, the Ukrainian military is not strong enough to throw them out. So there is this awful feeling that there might be a stalemate on the ground. It's a question of whether the stalemate on the ground can be considered a basis for a ceasefire and an end to the war. But as I said before, a ceasefire is one thing, a peace agreement is another. I can't see the basis of a fair and lasting peace agreement anytime soon.
Also, US President Donald Trump spoke to a room of top donors at his Florida club last week, according to the Wall Street Journal, and he described ending Russia's war in Ukraine as a growing frustration that keeps him up at night, according to Wall Street Journal sources. Do you feel that Trump is finally getting ready to impose sanctions against Russia, to inflict pain on Russia and put pressure not only on Ukraine but also on Russian side?
Well, I think Trump has got to make a decision in his own mind. Is he going to continue to support President Zelensky and Ukraine and keep up the pressure on Vladimir Putin, and that would mean imposing more sanctions and any other measures that can be brought to bear? Or is he going to do, as he sometimes seems to do, is change his mind, switch his focus to elsewhere, and decide for himself, well, I've given trying to get a peace deal in Ukraine the best shot. It's not possible. I'm going to put my energy into other issues. I'm going to put my energy into ending illegal migration into the United States. I'm going to put my energy into countering the threat from China. And well, I've tried it in Ukraine. No one's listening to me, so I'm going to look elsewhere. I think that's the decision that he's got to make. Is he going to persist helping Ukraine drive a harder bargain with Putin, or is he going to say, it can't be done, I'm going to waste my energy here, I'm going to go elsewhere?
If US withdraws from these negotiations over ceasefire, would it be good or bad scenario for Vladimir Putin?
Well, if Trump withdraws from the negotiations, in the short term, it would be to Putin's advantage. But I think we have to take European leaders at their word. European leaders are standing absolutely foursquare with Ukraine. And if the Americans decide to do less to support Ukraine, I would hope very much that European leaders will stand by their word and that we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as you want that support to get a fair and just outcome for this situation, which is totally illegal, outrageous, and brought about entirely by Russia and Putin's hubris and bad decision making back in February 2022.
Also, there is a running assassination campaign deep inside Russia. Russian General Yaroslav Moskalik has been killed in car bomb attack recently, and also last year General Igor Kirillov has been killed in this bomb attack. He was head of the Russia's chemical forces. How do you see the consequences of these assassinations on Russia's thinking about ceasefire deal?
Well, you raised two very interesting points there. I don't think it's been proven definitively who was behind those two assassinations, but the thought must be going through other senior Russian generals' minds. Well, am I under threat? Could someone be trying to kill me? Is it the Ukrainians? Is it dissident members of the Russian armed forces? Is it other terrorist groups within Russia? So this plays into the uncertainty amongst the Russian military leadership. And if we step back and look at that in isolation, we see that as a positive sign that, just go back to the earlier part of this conversation, it might start to influence some of the Russian military to think again that perhaps they ought to be thinking of taking action and ending this war. As I said, I thought it was possible 3 years ago. I've recently thought it was less likely, but you're quite right to draw attention to these two assassinations, which may well be putting question marks in the minds of other senior Russian generals.
Also, I would like to cover with you just shortly this minerals deal between Ukraine and the United States. Do you feel that this deal aligns Ukraine and the US and at least force Donald Trump to support Ukraine, to act in Ukrainian interests?
Well, if I'm being honest, I'm uncomfortable with this deal. I think it's only come about because Donald Trump has put pressure on Vladimir Zelensky, and I think it is unreasonable. Other European countries have been giving support to Ukraine without demanding anything back, and I'm uncomfortable with the notion of the United States wanting to have some reward for the support that is being given to Ukraine. Supporting Ukraine is the right thing to do, and when it's the right thing to do, then you just do it because it's the right thing to do. You don't need to be paid for it or to be rewarded for it. And if Trump believes that by having American mining people in the east of the country, that provides some kind of security guarantee, then I think he's deluding himself. And if I'm right, I think many of the richest parts of the mineral resources of Ukraine are in the eastern part of the country, much of which is already under Russian control. So I think it's an unfortunate deal in principle. I think it's a difficult deal to probably make work in practice. And morally, I don't think it's the right thing to do. You give support because it's the right thing to do. You don't expect to be rewarded for it. Yes, you can be thanked, but you don't need to be rewarded or paid.
Also, according to The Telegraph, the United Kingdom is secretly preparing for a war with Russia in case of Russian attack. Also, the governmental officials have been asked to update 20-year-old plans, emergency plans, that would put the country on war footing in case of Russia's attack, in case of full-scale war. Why didn't the UK government begin to prepare such plans 3 years ago, at least?
Well, it's a good question, and thank you for asking it. I believe it is the right thing to do. Not that the British government is preparing to fight a war against Russia today, but two or three things are important here. One is that there is a growing realization that we need to spend more money on defense so that we are better prepared to deter further aggression from Russia. And as part of that preparedness, which is part of deterrence, then it is sensible to update the war plans, the war book, which we always had in a state of readiness during the years of the Cold War. When the Cold War ended, it was felt that there wouldn't be another conflict in Europe. So therefore, these measures were allowed to sit on the shelf and get rather dusty. But now it's been realized that there is a threat to our security here. We need to spend more on defense to make sure that our military capability is good enough to deter further aggression. But it also makes sense at the same time to make sure that the civil government, the civil authorities, the population is prepared to know how to react if the worst should come to the worst, and that there should be an attack on the United Kingdom. So this is sensible, precautionary contingency planning being taken by the United Kingdom, and it shouldn't be misunderstood that we are expecting to go to war or indeed wanting to go to war with Russia. That is not the case. We want to do everything we can to deter further war and deter further aggression into our country, into the Baltic states, into Poland, Sweden, Finland, and critically, of course, also into Ukraine.
Also, in a recent article for The Telegraph, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, retired British Army colonel, is urging the UK government also to produce tactical nuclear weapons, to develop tactical nuclear capabilities to better deter Russia from attacking NATO's countries and the UK. Would you be in favor of such a plan to also produce, develop tactical nuclear capabilities?
Well, again, that's a very good question. As you know, the United Kingdom has a strategic ballistic nuclear missile capability mounted from our continuous at-sea deterrence from our submarines. But below that, we don't have our own tactical nuclear weapons. The United States does, but the United Kingdom gave that up. If one believes that there is any potential for nuclear escalation, then there is an argument, and I'm not sure yet that I agree with it, there is an argument to say that the United Kingdom should develop smaller nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, so that we have something with which, if necessary, we could respond between conventional response and strategic nuclear response. Therefore, to have the option of a tactical nuclear weapon to make a statement and cause limited destruction, there is an argument for it. I don't think I've quite closed my own mind as to whether it's the right thing to do. Because we are still in close contact militarily with the United States and they have that capability, I think for the time being, I am content that we rely on that American capability. If at some point America was to become fundamentally isolationist and, heaven forbid, leave NATO and withdraw entirely from Europe, then the situation would be different, and we would probably then would need to develop our own tactical nuclear weapons. But we're not in that situation yet.
Thank you, Lord Dannatt, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. A pleasure to talk to you, and my very best wishes to you and all the people of Ukraine, both at home and abroad.